That's because he's a nerd. Your turn.
Yeah, thanks everybody for having me out. So, I spend a lot of my time thinking about Belgian beer if I'm not drinking it, and I spent much of the last year living in Europe. So a lot of this research was done in Europe. Some of my favorite Belgian beers are saisons and then also grisette. So I got into this rabbit hole of researching grisette, and I'm going to talk to you today about the sort of stuff I've learned. Maybe I could send somebody to the fridge to grab some beers for me. So Nathaniel, there's two lines. Grab the not dry hopped line. So I brought two grisettes here of beers that I think accurately reflect grisette. I sort of got into this research because I was seeing a lot of beers that didn't accurately reflect grisette. So I'd like to talk about what I think grisette is, and that's based off of about 8 months of research in historic Belgian texts. So my goal today is not to give you clone recipes so you can go and clone a grisette. It's more to discuss characteristics of grisette so that you could then decide to make a grisette or not, but use some of the characteristics of grisette to make whatever beer it is that you want to make. It's my understanding that these slides will be available to you, so don't worry about trying to capture everything on the slides, and I think I'm being recorded as well. So it's going to be a two-part talk so that you don't have to listen to me for a solid block of time and get a break in the middle. I'm going to start with some background, some introductory information, and then a background on Belgian brewing in general, and a little bit into a background on grisette. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll get into grisette brewing specifics, so ingredients for grisette, recipes for grisette, a comparison of grisette to saison, because I think that's how a lot of people contextualize grisette, and then looking into to some modern grisette. You guys, come on. I trust you can figure it out. This research was possible based on a number of people. So Thierry, the first name there, helped me find a lot of sources for this, or one major source for this. And so a lot of this work was possible because he gave me that source. Niels Lunens is a friend of mine in Belgium. He's a young guy that is interested in lambic culture and history, and again helped me find a lot of sources. Discusses with Yvonne debates. He's the brewer of De La Seine, co-owner and brewer of De La Seine, and knows more about saison than anybody else in the world. Daniel Thirier runs Brasserie Thirier in northern France, so that's where Yeast 3711 is theoretically from, although I believe that two yeasts are different. Chris Van de Waal is a brewer in western Flanders, also a beer historian. Jacques Triffin collected a lot of labels, so I'm going to show a number of historic labels throughout this talk. All the labels come from Jacques. So he's collected all these labels and made them available, which is awesome. Stan Hieronymus also pointed me to some sources and gave me some helpful thoughts while I was putting this together. Amos Brown writes a blog called Brown and Bitter, and he's interested in this sort of historical stuff too, so he and I swap sources back and forth. And then a friend in Victoria, I'm from Victoria, so a friend in Victoria, Jeffrey, always asks me difficult questions, and I have to figure out how to answer them, and that's sort of what pushes me to learn more. So one more little preface slide before I get into this. A lot of this research is based on conjecture, assumption, and reasoning, because there's not a lot of comprehensive historic information. So as I'm going through these texts, there's not a complete description from everything I'd like to know about what the beer would have been like. So I had to kind of fill in the gaps based on what I know about Belgian brewing in general and what I know about this beer style in general. I think it's important to note that these beers are heterogeneous entities, so there's not one single thing that is grisette. Both within a given time and through different times, grisette is a heterogeneous entity. So grisette in 1800 will be different than 1900. Grisette at producer A will be different than grisette at producer B. So I'm discussing a range of beers and trying to kind of pinpoint the core of that range around which there's other beers. Mostly I'm looking around 1900, so most of my information comes from either about 1874 or the mid-1900s, which is a bit of a disconnect, as I just mentioned, based on the heterogeneity of these beers. Historical scholars didn't really care about beers like grisette or beers like saison. They cared about the major beers being brewed by the major breweries. So there's not a lot of sources that even discuss these beers because they're small, poor person beers in their origin. the information that's available is scattered, so there'll be a couple sentences in one book, and then there'll be a couple sentences in another book. And it's biased towards the larger producers, because those are the producers that the scholars cared about. Sometimes even for native francophones, the language is difficult because it's French in the 1800s. So it's confusing to figure out what it says, even if you can read what it says. And I'll apologize now for anything I say that is a French word, for anybody in this room that is fluent in French. So that leads to an over-reliance on few sources that may or may not be representative, but it's basically the best that we have. So I'm going to present to you the best that I have, and I imagine that my understanding will be refined as I find more sources. But I can say, without feeling like I'm overinflating my value in this style, that there's only a couple people in the world that know more about grisette than me, because there's only a couple people that have bothered to find all these different texts in the 1800s. And I'm probably the one that knows the most that doesn't speak French. Okay, so getting into general Belgian history. So Belgium gained independence in 1830. It's not a very large country, and historically it was ruled by the Netherlands or by the French or by the Germans and Austrians. So a diverse history within the ruling parties of Belgium. In 1830 it gained independence. It has a language divide that runs along this line here. So everything north of this line is Flemish, everything south of this line is French-speaking. This little circle in the middle is the Brussels region, and that's mostly French-speaking, even though it's on the Flemish or Dutch-speaking side of Belgium. Agriculture in Belgium, for things that brewers care about, is centered mostly in this area. So most of the hop production in modern Belgium happens in Poperinge, which is about here, and happens in Aalst, which is about there. The prime barley growing region of Belgium is this little strip next to the coast. So there's the coast, there's some sand dunes, and then there's a strip of land that's the optimum barley growing region of Belgium. And that's right here, so that's the polders. So this is where if brewers were hunting for the best Belgian ingredients, they'd be hunting mostly in this area. But grains were grown all over Belgium, and still are grown all over Belgium, and hops as well. Some Belgian law that's going to be relevant to this discussion today are taxation. So there's probably some people in this room that spend all their time thinking about Belgian beer, and there's probably some people in this room that hate Belgian beer, and I'm sorry that you have to sit through so much discussion of Belgian beer. But if you're really keen on Belgian beer, you probably know about some tax laws. But alcohol taxes really throughout the world influence the way that alcohol production progressed. And in Belgium, alcohol taxes from 1822 to 1885 were based on the size of the mash tun. So it's not how strong the beer is, it's not how much beer you make, it's how big your equipment is. And that means that the brewers devised stupid ways to get the most out of the smallest equipment that they could get away with, to try to avoid paying taxes. So some of the mashing that I'm going to discuss later is basically because of this mash tun. After 1885, they moved to a taxation scheme based on the volume of beer and the strength of the beer, which is probably the most reasonable way to do it. And at that point, things got simpler. Secondly, as it pertains to the labels that I'm going to show, in 1941, Belgium introduced a deposit on bottles. So any label that says vidange in 1941 or maybe 1942 and says 1 franc or 2 francs, those labels are after 1940. And if it doesn't say that, it's probably before 1940, but not certainly. So that allows one to get a little bit more information just by looking at a label, the sort of time period that label is coming from, because the label itself doesn't have any timestamp. Context within Belgium for beer strength. Around 1900, the average strength of the beer was on the order of 3%. So original gravity's on around 1030, which is quite in contrast to modern Belgian beer. When people think about modern Belgian beer, they think of Belgian beer as being generally fairly strong. And when people think about modern British beer, they think about modern British beer generally as not being very strong in the global comparison. In 1900, that was exactly the opposite. The British beer was a strong beer when it was coming into Belgium, and the Belgian beer was generally fairly weak. Before the 1900s. Around 1900, the Belgian beer strength started to increase towards levels that we would expect today. So I'm going to be talking about beers coming from the Hainaut province, and this is this red area here. So the westernmost province in the French-speaking part of Belgium. the Belgian economy in the north was driven historically generally by trade. So you have a couple cities that are big cities that were trade centers. In the south, the economy was driven mostly by industrial activity. So you have mining and steel manufacturing and glass manufacturing spread in a lot of little towns throughout the south. So, so the southern part of Belgium and the Hainaut province economically grew as a bunch of small centers rather than a couple giant cities. And that influenced that every small center was going to have a brewery or multiple breweries for the region instead of everybody coming to one big region. So it influenced the way that the province progressed. And interestingly, grisette as a style doesn't really exist anymore. And it disappeared in the 1960s, which is about the same time that the industry itself collapsed. So grisette's a beer that, that gets tied to industry and industrial activity. And as industrial activity in Belgium was in its demise, grisette, coincidentally or causationally, was also in its demise. To give a general context of the size of Belgium and where we're talking about, this lower figure here is Belgium on the lower mainland to the same scale. So if this little dot about halfway between Vancouver and Whistler is Brussels, we're talking about the Sunshine Coast stretching maybe to Vancouver, but mostly the Sunshine Coast. And that's sort of the region that, that these beers are coming from. So not a very big country, and we're really zooming in on one small area. Okay, brewing process in historical Belgian brewing. Use simple equipment and generally poor temperature control. So, so fermentation, and this is maybe not unique to Belgium, but fermentation would be poorly temperature controlled, and mashing as well would be somewhat variable temperature, lots of heat loss. I mentioned that that mashing in Belgium, or that taxation in Belgium, was based on the mash tun, the size of the mash tun. So, so brewers would overload that mash tun. They'd put a ton of grain in it and put as little water as possible, so they could extract the most fermentable material from that grain and make the most beer out of it. But in order to do that, they had to be able to put water in and then take that water out to put more water in, because otherwise they'd overflow their mash tun. So they devised these very difficult and complicated mashing procedures. The mash tuns in historic Belgian brewing are sort of hockey puck shaped or tuna can shaped and not directly heated. So it's this iron, short and fat circle, maybe wood lined on the outside to help it retain a bit of heat, but it's losing most of its heat out the top. And it's not directly heated. So lots of infusions of hot water into the top, draining off that liquid in a turbid mash type approach, the sort of thing that you'd see in modern day lambic brewing, or maybe decoction mashing as well. So draining water out so that you can put more water in to get to the next mash temperature to get the conversion that you need, draining that back out, putting more water in top. Very difficult mashing, not the sort of normal mashing that one would choose to do. Boils were fairly long, and the general thinking of the time was that a long boil was a good thing. So boils of 2 to 6 hours are relatively normal. Boils of 10 hours are not unheard of. Boils of 30 minutes or 1 hour would be crazy. Nobody would ever do that. So,
Tim, you're screwed.
yeah. So a totally different landscape than what we think of now for beer. Fermentation would have been in barrels or open tanks. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. And open cooling, either with a cool ship, and cool ship doesn't necessarily mean lambic. It's just a way to cool the beer without using any extra resources. So a big shallow pan that you put the hot boiling wort into, and overnight it cools. And then you ferment that normally with a pitch of yeast, and that becomes your beer. Or using a bottle-o chiller. And if you're not familiar with what those are, it's sort of like a snake of pipes, and cold water is running through the pipes, and the beer is running down the outside of the pipes. So the beer is exposed to the air. It's like a counterflow chiller if you didn't have 2 tubes. You only have 1 tube, and then you just pour the beer over that tube. So fairly simplistic, but that was like the hot shit. Like that was, if you moved to that from a cool ship, like you were kind of a big deal. Okay, so let's get into some of the ingredients that brewers would have been using. Belgian grain would have been a 6-row barley. So up until about World War II, Belgium didn't have 2-row barley. So all the grains would have been 6-row, which is fundamentally different than what we're using now for brewing. And it would have been mostly a winter 6-row called escargot. And this winter 6-row is like the classic grain of Belgium that generally brewers thought was pretty good, especially if you're making an aged beer. If you're making a young beer, maybe it's kind of rough and it's not the ideal grain to use. And in the spring 6-row barley, which would have been a little bit softer. If you're not familiar with differences between 6-row and 2-row barley, the 6-row has more husk material and more protein material per unit starch. So in order to get the same amount of sugar, you get more husk exposure and more protein, higher protein levels from that 6-row grain. So what that means is that the beer might taste a little bit rougher. You might get more astringency coming from that husk material, from the tannins. What it also means is that with more proteins, if you're processing those proteins appropriately, both in the malting and the brewing, you get darker color from the same sort of temperature profiles. So by Maillard reactions of proteins reacting with sugars, higher proteins means you can make more of these reactions. So from a certain kilning temperature with a 6-row grain, you would get a darker malt. And from a certain duration of boil with a 6-row grain, you would get a darker brew. So it helped Belgian beer be a little bit darker without as much temperature input. What that probably means for most Belgian beers is that they weren't black, but maybe they weren't golden either. Maybe they were kind of in the amber range, whether or not they were intended to be that dark because of using this grain. Brewing specific barleys generally around the world were introduced in the mid-1900s. So before this point, barleys for brewing were also barleys for animal feed. And there wasn't a distinction that this crop is a brewing crop and this crop is a feed crop. So the farmer will be growing barley, and some of that barley will be split off to go to animal feed, and some of that barley will be split off to go to brewing. But that means that the barley itself isn't specifically tailored for the needs of brewing. So it's unevenly germinating when the maltster wants to use it. It doesn't sprout evenly. It doesn't convert evenly. So that when brewers when the maltsters are taking that malt, they don't get a uniform product in the end. And then brewers are not getting a uniform malt as well from that. So it means the historic malts would have been more heterogeneous than a modern malt would be in terms of their enzymatic potential and their color, as well as possibly things like how hard the grain was and how easy it was to extract sugar from it. Also, other grains used in Belgium would have been wheat, oats, or spelt. Some rye as well, although it seems less common in the historic Belgian literature than something like spelt or wheat. So malting, I talked a little bit about just now. It was poor compared to modern practices because of these unevenly sprouting grains and variable conversion of those grains, so you don't get the same sort of enzyme capacity from that grain. The malting capacity was also more limited, so the grain was not evenly dry, which means that when you kiln it, you have some caramelization of some grains because they're still a little bit wet. Other grains get kilned normally and turn into the normal kiln type malts or Pilsner type malts that you get. So heterogeneity within the malt, leading to not one uniform color or one uniform taste profile when the brewer then gets that malt. Thinking about hops in general in historic Belgian brewing, in the 1800s and early 1900s, there was a healthy amount of landrace Belgian hops grown. So now when we think about landrace hops, the sorts of hops that you come across are hops like Saaz or Tettnang, or some of the English hops like Goldings and Fuggles, these hops that have been around for a long time. Belgium had its own hops that have been around for a long time until about mid-1900s, and now they're not around anymore, like at all. So Belgian brewers would have been using some of these traditional Belgian hops that were hops like Green Bell, Corndial, or White Rank, and until English hops began to be imported. And for whatever reason, probably a mixture of how well the hops grew, how good they were for use in beer, and maybe how strong they were, so that brewers had to use less of other hops. Imported hops, hop rhizomes, and hop plants tended to do well in Belgium in terms of what the farmers were going to grow. So the Belgian hops were displaced and vanished almost completely. It turns out they are still around in a couple places, but basically the Belgian hops are gone. And they're not grown commercially except for a couple revivalists just recently in Belgium. And now Belgium tends to grow English hops. If a Belgian brewer was choosing their hops and had unlimited funds, they would choose either Bohemian hops, so something like Saaz, like Czech hops, Bavarian hops, something like Hallertau or Tettnang, or English hops, something like East Kent Goldings. And that would be like the prime hops to the Belgian brewer. Most Belgian brewers weren't using the best hops in all their beers, so then they would use hops from the good regions of Belgium, Aalst and Poperinge, which I just mentioned previously. And so Poperinge is on the southwest corner of Belgium, and Aalst is sort of west of Brussels, but generally in the center of Belgium. And outside of that, if the brewers were then going to go to the next low level, which is probably what the simple rural Hainaut brewers would have done, they're using locally grown hops. So there's a hierarchy of the hops, and the amount of hops that you want to use for a given result would vary considerably based on which region your hops are coming from. The hops are generally low alpha hops, so you have a lot of hop material going in to get a given amount of bitterness compared to what we would do now as we brew. But much like if you're using Saaz hops today, or some of the older French hops like Swisselspalt, they're low alpha hops. So if you want high bitterness, you have to use a lot of hops. This is a hop field in Poperinge, and it's May here, and they're just starting to train their vines in the line. These are probably English hops. But this is an ad down here from a traditional Belgian variety. It's no longer found in Belgium, Greenbelt, from this Aalst region in the center of Belgium. Okay, so if you came to this talk and you're like, I love Saison and Grisette, I know everything there is to know about Saison and Grisette. Before about a year ago, this is everything there is to know about Grisette. On one slide here, like 10 lines. If you know nothing about Grisette, that's great, because in one slide, I can tell you everything about Grisette. So we're good. Like, after this slide, we'll all be on the same page, presuming you haven't listened to the things I've said before or read the things I've written. So this comes from Farmhouse Ales and Brewing with Wheat, which are two excellent books that if you're into Belgian brewing for Farmhouse Ales and German brewing and Belgian brewing for Brewing with Wheat, you should get these books. So Farmhouse Ales says that Grisette is a 3 to 5% beer that's light-bodied, dry, and refreshing, that it's generally Saison-like, but that it's hoppy and not acidic, in contrast to what Saison would have been. And that it's golden or blonde colored, but others say that it's amber colored, because it's taking info from different sources. It says that it's a 3 to 5% beer, but it also says that the original gravity is about 16.3 to 17.5 Plato, which is a pretty massive difference. So that's like, you have a 3 to 5% beer that starts in the 1060s to 1070s original gravity, which definitely doesn't line up. So we'll get back to that a bit later. Brewing with Wheat says that Grisette was about 10.2 to 11 Plato, depending on the season and the class. We'll get back to season and class later. That it's a wheat beer, and that wheat makes up about 10% of the grist. And it's between white and brown in color, so it's not super pale, but it's not super dark. And that there's 3 strength classes of Grisette. And it's a relatively modern beer for the time that it was brewed. So at whatever time this brewer was making Grisette was not a simple rustic beer. It was a relatively highly skilled beer for the time. Both sources make a strong point. They're saying that modern Belgian Grisette doesn't equal historic Grisette. And I would echo that for North America. Almost every North American Grisette doesn't follow what historic Grisette was, because this is all the information that they had to work with. And if you ignore a couple parts of this, you can make pretty much any beer out there. You can make a golden beer or an amber beer. You can make a really strong beer or a weak beer. If you ignore this line, it doesn't say anything about it. You can make it however hoppy or acidic you want. So there's not a lot of information out about it, and brewers kind of took free reign to make beers that are Grisettes. So if you've been confused up until this point, I'm sorry. Probably should have said this at the beginning. Grisette is a pale, somewhat hoppy, low-strength, refreshing beer to be drank in summertime. Okay, last bit of historic ingredients here, and this will be important for Grisette. Looking at yeast. So brewers were chilling their beers with cool ships, or these Barlow chillers, and then because of this, partly, ale yeast was not a pure culture. So if a brewer was making an ale, they were using a mixture of yeast and wild yeast and bacteria some combination of those three things to make their beer. So if it's a young beer and it's prepared appropriately, it's not acidic. If it's a young beer and it's not highly hopped, it would be acidic. And if it's an old beer, it would probably be acidic. So the nature of the beer that comes out depends quite strongly on how long the brewer is waiting between brew day and drink day. Brewers in all over Europe were fairly slow to successfully use pure culture fermentation ales, partly because of the difficulty behind it, and partly because it didn't make the beers that tasted like they were used to, because they weren't used to drinking pure culture beer. So lagers would have been pure culture by this point, generally. But ales would not have been, and then when a brewer made an ale with a pure culture, they're like, oh, something's wrong with this beer, because it doesn't taste like it tastes different than my mixed culture, and I like the taste of the mixed culture. And fermentations taking place in barrels and open tanks. So I put this quote on here from 1918 from a British brewing journal. And I put the whole quote because I think the whole quote's interesting, but specifically I want to highlight this little section here. The way that these British brewing journals at the time work is that some author writes a paper and brings it to this group of other beer nerds and reads the paper to them. And they all listen and are generally polite, even if they think the author's full of shit. And then at the end they have this discussion, and that discussion is transcribed in the modern paper. So if you go look at this paper, you can see the discussion they had afterwards. And they go back and forth and say things like, oh, I think that was an excellent talk, and we thank you very kindly for coming to talk to us. Did you consider that you might be completely wrong? Things like this work their way in there. But they're discussing yeast in this case in Belgian brewing. And this fellow, Mr. Holton, says, in practice, owing to inevitable contamination, it was doubtful whether there was ever such a thing as pure yeast in a top fermentation brewery. So in 1918, this prominent British brewing scientist says, pure cultures don't exist in ales. And that's like not even 100 years ago. So that gives you an idea of the landscape of brewing ales. Okay, so back to grisette. I estimate the origin of grisette to be in the 1700s. And I think it starts in the Scheldt and the Dender River areas. So here again we have Belgium. This is the line between Dutch-speaking Belgium and French-speaking Belgium. The Hainaut province is on this side of Belgium. And this is the Scheldt and this is the Dender. So in this sort of area here, which again puts us in the Sunshine Coast, in the scope of this generally being Whistler, this is where I think grisette is coming from, based on the sources that I've seen and the towns that they're mentioning with breweries that make grisette. I think it's starting in the 1700s because the first mention I've seen is 1812, and in this mention it's a brewery that exports its grisette at least regionally, if not internationally. So if this brewery is established making grisette by 1812, it was probably also making it before 1800. So somewhere in the 1700s is my guess for where grisette starts. The historic sources tend to give very nondescript rundowns of what grisette was. So it was a special wheat beer, a special beer blanc, and it was top fermentation. It was relatively clear, and it was consumed in the summertime, and it was a refreshing beer with a noticeable hoppiness. Grisette was a class of beers rather than one distinct beer. So in the same way that bitters, you can have a class within bitters, and in the same way that in stouts, you can have a class within stouts. Grisette was a class of beers and not one discrete entity of beer. Standard grisette, which is the lowest level of this class, was a young beer, and it was brewed year-round. So I just said that grisettes were classes. There's three levels to this class. There's young and ordinary grisette. There's grisette de saison, and there's superior or double grisette. Grisette de saison comes from the same general name derivation that saison comes from. So saison is bière de saison, and that was shortened to saison. And so a beer brewed in the season, meaning the winter time, the prime brewing season. So young ordinary grisette is brewed year-round. Grisette de saison is only brewed in the winter. Superior double grisette also would have been brewed in the winter. If you're brewing a young ordinary grisette in the summertime, then you would make it a little bit stronger and a little bit hoppier to deal with the summer conditions. Grisette de saison was also stronger, and it was also hoppier to let it last a little bit longer. And superior double grisette was not using the later runnings of the brew. So young and ordinary grisette and grisette de saison would have been whole brews going to that one beer. Superior grisette would have been a split brew, so they make a young or a small beer out of that. So most of the wort is going towards, most of the sugar is going towards superior or double grisette. A lot of very weak wort is going to a table beer. That table beer is boiled for like 10 hours. It uses the used hops from the superior grisette, and then that would be like a standard table drinking beer. The general recipe is kept fairly constant among these different styles. So the thing that changes is how hoppy it is and how strong it is. These labels here show some of these different elements. So these are both double grisettes. This is a category 3 grisette, which we'll talk about probably after intermission, maybe before. And this is a bière de ménage, like a household grisette, so probably also a lower strength beer.
Dave, is there any indication of if they were, I mean, I'm sure maybe not, but there's any indication if the breweries at the time were copying beer that had already existed in people's houses, they were making themselves or something like that, or if this was just something breweries had come up with that's convenient to make, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. It probably wasn't the sort of beer that people made a lot in their houses, at least not this way, but maybe brewers tasted that and were like, oh, that's an interesting taste profile in a beer. Maybe I should make a beer of that nature. It's possible that was happening, but the process of making grisette was fairly advanced, so it's unlikely that general people were doing it in their house. There is an interesting parallel. They certainly were looking at beer, imported beer, and the characteristics of imported beer, and thinking, okay, that tastes good. How do we make a beer that kind of has those tastes, but that we can sell for cheaper because it's not imported? So grisette predates Pilsner, but there is a fair amount of overlap, I think, between grisette and Pilsner. So that is a good point, that brewers were not in boxes. They were looking around them and saying, what's happening out there? What pieces of that can I use to make my own beer? Yeah, good point. Okay, so grisette strength. We said just a bit ago that grisette was both 3 to 5% and an original gravity in the 1060s to 1070s. So what's going on with this? Well, that's what Farmhouse Ales says, citing different sources. Brewing with Wheat says 10.2 to 11 Plato, which is in the range of 3 to 5%, depending on where your final gravity falls. The information for both of these, for both Brewing with Wheat and Farmhouse Ales, comes from the same initial source, which is a bit curious that they came out with such different final results. The problem is that the source, this Pelset text in 1874, which is the one and only book in existence that was focused on grisette, said that a summer young grisette would have been about 6.25 to 6.5 degrees, and a grisette de saison would have been 7 degrees on an ordinary brewer's scale, which I'm sure made wonderful sense to brewers at the time. But to us, we're like, what the hell is that? What is an ordinary brewer's scale? If you look at the 3 scales that were in use at Belgium at that time, 6 degrees is either 1022, 1040, or 1060. So that's a pretty important difference. Okay, so to try to figure out which of these is the accurate one, I looked at all the grisette labels that I could find, and I found 29 labels. And I looked at the labels, and you can see here, there's that says Category 1, this says Category 2, this says Category 3. As I was looking through the labels, I started to pick out, well, some of these labels are saying things like this. So I found one Category 1, I put an asterisk there, because that's a fairly recent beer. So I think it's not representative of, it's not representative of most of the history of grisette, but it exists. It's Category 1 grisette. There's one Category 2 label, that's right there, and there are 2 Category 3 labels. So grisette spans a big range here, but not a lot on the Category 1 side. More on the Category 3 side. There's also 2 labels that mention a household beer and 4 labels that mention a table beer, which suggests not a strong beer, more of a general drinking beer than a strong beer. So in the modern Belgian world, those categories have a meaning. It's related to tax structure. So this is the Belgian tax structure here with categories. So a Category S beer is 1065 or higher. A Category 1 beer is 1044 to 1054. A Category 2 beer is 1016 to 1038. And a Category 3 beer is less than 1016. You notice that these don't line up, which is kind of weird. And also that there's quite a big range covered by some of these. So this information comes from the Brewers publications, the old style series of Brewers publications, the Belgian Ale Book. And And I haven't been able to confirm this with any other sources. So this is the best that I have. But it lines up roughly with the modern Dutch ranges. And this says that category 2 and 3 are pretty low strength beers. Category 2 being slightly below this gravity given here, and category 2 definitely lining up with 3 to 5%. So grisette, it seems, based on the labels, fell in the category 2 to 3 range, and on these reported strengths, probably also roughly the category 2 range. So this is the most complete picture I can give you about what strength the normal grisette would have been. Certainly not this. This interprets the ordinary brewer's scale to be the 1060 side of things, which I think is undeniably wrong based on the strengths given and the labels.
So then what would the superior grisette be?
So the superior grisette would have been up in this range. Unfortunately, this Calcette text literally says the superior grisette would have been stronger than 7. We'll get to that later. And nowhere in the rest of the book. So, which is, later was like, we'll get to it later when you come over to my house for some beer.
But is it that the superior would have been 16 Plato?
It could have been. Yeah, you're right. It definitely could have been 16 Plato. I know that the source that says this is using Calcette. So they've just misinterpreted the units. But you're right. Superior grisette could have been around 1060 or around 16 Plato. That would have been quite believable. Yeah. Okay, so I think now you've listened to me enough. So I'll take a break and I'll come back and talk about grisette recipe specifics. I'll get into some brewing specifics now.
All right, please be quiet.
Cool. All right, thanks. So we've covered a lot of background information, so now I can get to the brewing. I'll try to move a little more rapidly. The beer going around now is the same as the previous beer, except dry hopped at about 0.5 gram per liter. So I really like dry hop, but dry hop is Syrian Goldings. And we'll get to the recipe for that beer at the end, if you are curious. So for hopping your grisette, I mentioned before this hop hierarchy, where basically the non-Belgian hops are better than the Belgians. The good Belgian hops come from these 2 towns, Alston, Popperinga, and then the bad Belgian hops are the bottom tier Belgian hops are elsewhere. So the Wallonian brewers would have been using Wallonian hops. The higher classes of grisette, because we just covered that there were 3 different classes, the higher classes would have used better hops to make a better beer overall. And the beer would optionally have been dry hopped. Some sources say talk about the dry hopping of grisette, and some, mostly they don't mention it, which doesn't confirm or deny that it happened. So I don't think it's necessary for grisette. But if you're going to dry hop, low levels of English or Czech hops are what's recommended. Bavarian hops not recommended for dry hop. The rates of hopping depend on the class of grisette you're making and the season in which you make it. So I've got ordinary grisette brewed in the winter, an ordinary grisette brewed in the summer, and a grisette de saison. This table here is because of the hierarchy of hops and different hops being different degrees of potent. This table is roughly equivalent based on conversion factors I found in historic Belgian brewing. I keep a beer blog that focuses a lot on either the home brewing I'm doing or historic Belgian beer. So I've got a larger version of the same table with all the sources from where the information comes from and well annotated. But this is the gist of it. So if you're brewing an ordinary grisette in the summertime for summer drinking, using about 4 grams per liter of good hops, or up to 6 grams per liter of the poor Belgian hops. So if you're like, man, I'm so excited about grisette, and there's probably one of you in this room, and it is me. Here's a recipe for me to look at for when I want to brew a historic grisette. I would target an OG, original gravity, in 1030 to 1040. As we covered, there's a bit of ambiguity for the ideal original gravity. I would use spring barley. Sources mention both spring barley and a winter barley, this escargot. 6-row barleys, if you're really trying to get historic. I think spring barley would be better because the winter barley tends to be a good choice for aging beers. And an ordinary grisette would not have been an aged beer, so a spring barley would have been the better choice. And that has to do with a little bit with the protein characteristics of the grain, how the grain progressed through its life cycle and drought stress in the winter in Europe. about 10 to 15% chitted wheat. If chitted wheat is something you've not heard before, don't worry, because it's not common. So chit malt is malt that's been barely modified. So like as the grain is sprouting and as the maltster is processing it, when it just starts to sprout and there's a little nub that comes out the end, that's the chit. And chitted malt is killed at that point when it just has this little nub. So it's like it's basically as unmalted as you can make a malt. So that's chit malt. You can get chitted barley a little bit easier, and it's a German thing because German brewers have to use malt, so they can't use flaked barley. So they have the most unmalted barley possible, chit malt. Castle Malting or Chateau Malting, a Belgian maltery, does sell a chitted wheat if you really wanted to source one. And more than 15% wheat is probably okay. The historic text that discusses the wheat specifically is very emphatic that if A has to be malted, and B should be this chitted wheat, although they don't use the term chitted. But it's because it's not a Belgian term. So the malt was very under-modified, especially this wheat, as I mentioned. So basically it's as unmalted as you can make a malt. And it was kilned at a very low temperature, sort of like almost a wind-dried malt. So it wouldn't have been a very dark malt. It would have been quite a pale malt. Hops would have been Belgian landrace hops or Belgian-grown English hops for most of the grisettes. For the better grisettes, you might have imported some hops. And depending on the strength of grisette, as we've just covered, and the season in which it's brewed, the hopping rate would have varied, but on the order of 4 grams per liter. If you're using Belgian hops, it's probably that way for the better Belgian hops. Fermentation would have been a mixed culture top fermentation, but the important thing about grisette, and I think this is the defining characteristic, is that it wouldn't have been a beer designed for long aging, for the normal, ordinary grisette. So you wouldn't get a strong expression of this mixed culture. So you're putting in multiple yeasts and bacteria into it, but you're drinking it soon enough that those don't make a strong impact on the final beer. Dry hopping is optional. I would suggest if you do it on the order of half a gram per liter, which is what I did in this beer, is definitely noticeable, and it's a fairly clear characteristic of the beer, but it's not terribly strong. So timescales for grain to glass, on the order of weeks. So I brewed this beer a month and a day ago, the one that you've been drinking so far. So weeks to a month, maybe 2 months, would have fit kind of in the time frame of a young grisette. On the weeks to a month side would be better. I've got a remaining question about the yeast. So I don't have a clear answer. There's some valid arguments to say that grisette yeast would have been like a saison yeast, and it would have been very saison-y. And that's the way that I approach it, because that fits my personal taste and what I want. Another, I think, equally valid way to think about it is that grisette possibly would have used a more neutral flavor profile yeast, such as what Trappists might use fermented cool, something that would make a grisette more similar to a Pilsner in yeast profile. It's certainly an ale, but you could use a somewhat neutral yeast. And that's an ambiguity that I haven't answered, and I think I'm unlikely to ever answer, because the historic texts don't spend a lot of time talking about what the yeast would have been like in its specific flavor profile. They just say something like, add some yeast. Okay, so in the world of Belgian beer, so the lore of grisette and the lore of saison tie them both to the working class. But in the world of Belgian beer, once grisette became a thing, it wasn't necessarily a working class beer. So these are all newspaper ads from different time periods where breweries are selling their beer. And so we got 1883 here, 1911, and 1896, and I've highlighted these 3 grisettes. You can see by these ads that for some breweries, the grisette was the prime beer that they were offering. They were saying this superior grisette, this beer blonde half Bavarian is probably their pseudo Pilsner. That they don't quite make it a Pilsner. It's not a Bavarian style beer, but it's on the way there. So the grisette is like a prime beer, even above their pseudo Pilsner. But it's not their household brown beer or their strong brown beer. For this brewery, they're making a third strength a week beer, or third runnings beer, an ordinary brown, and then grisette comes in, and that's ahead of the other brown beers, or the stronger beers. So for this brewery, their grisette is like is on the weaker, more everyday range. Still about halfway through their price point. And in this brewery, the grisette, they're advertising two beers, and the grisette is the more expensive of the two, above the brown beer, the standard class beer. So, so similar to how there's different classes of grisette, grisette was viewed as a high-class beer at some breweries, and their grisette was a high-class beer. Some breweries is about the middle, but I've never seen it be the cheapest beer breweries offering. So that fits with grisette being a somewhat more complicated beer to make. It's somewhat of a specialty beer, even within rural Belgian breweries, that there's lore tying grisette to mining and working class industrial activities. I have not seen breweries selling grisettes at a working class price. This is not, like, the working class beer would have been the ordinary brown, or the third runnings beer, or maybe even this half beer here that's really weak. What's that? So we got 1883 here, 1896, and 1911. But grisette's falling in different places in the different years. But not necessarily a linear trend. Okay, so grisette and saison are equated by a lot of people, and I think they're very similar, but I don't think that the way that they equate it is quite accurate. So to discuss grisette in its place in beer, I want to talk a little bit about saison. So historic saison was discussed about as well as it will be in the English language by Vanbrewers, who wrote a chapter in the book Farmhouse Ale. So if you're really keen on saison and you haven't read that chapter, that's the best you could do for historic saison. If you're really keen on saison and you have read that chapter, I think you could read that chapter every week for a year and learn something new every time, because I've done it. So, I would recommend reading it frequently and paying attention to the information in it, because it's extremely dense and it's easy to underestimate how much work went into putting that together. Saisons historically were inherently beers designed for age. So the beers brewed in the wintertime. There were saisons brewed in the winter and drank in the winter, but generally it's a beer designed to age well. So the recommended grain of choice would have been this winter 6-row barley. That's a good grain to use, but not very good for a young beer. Possibly the addition of unmalted grains, because they could benefit a beer aging, but for grisette, the wheat had to be malted because it's a little bit better to make a younger beer. And higher hopping rates to regulate the degree to which the mixed culture could express itself on the bacterial side. So hopping highly, because you know there's bacteria in there, so you got to either control them or not by your hops. And so that's what the breweries would have been doing. Slightly higher gravity than average beer, and higher gravity than average beer depends on what time period you're looking at and what average beer would have been. So if around 1900 average beer was 1045 to 10, or sorry, around 1900 average beer was around 1040, 1050, and saison's probably up towards the 1050, 1060 end. A young saison, and even aged saisons, would have had more astringency from the use of this winter 6-row barley, as well as higher hopping rates. And as I mentioned, a mixed fermentation. So importantly, the time for this mixed fermentation to show up, because it's a beer for age, and the acidity being regulated by the hops. As I did with the grisettes, I did a saison label analysis, and so I looked at the total number of labels and split up the category 1, 2, and 3. I combined the category S and the category 1 for the purposes of this table, but grisette had the most category 3s, and then 1 and 1, so it's 2, 1, and 1 for grisette. Saison you can see is clustering at the high end here. So saison generally a stronger beer, which would help design it better for age. The labels I've got here are a class 1 saison, see the first category there, and then an old saison and an extra old saison. So saison labels also don't mention household or table, but they do tend to mention old, which would reinforce that it's a beer designed for age. And the brewers are advertising this because A, it costs more money, and B, the consumers, at least a certain class of consumers, wanted that taste in their beer. So they'd say, this is our old saison, because we know that you want old aged beer. So that information is right there on the label. And that influences the way that saison would present itself. Here's the same hopping table that I had for grisette, but I've now included the saison section here. And you can see that the saison hopping rates, these are the Petit Journal de Brasseur, which is a Belgian brewing journal from three different entries, 2 from 1902 and 1 from 1920, with the hopping rates described in those texts for saison. And you can see that they're generally quite a bit higher than grisette hopping rates, especially this ordinary grisette, the normal grisette. The Saison hopping rates are on the order of twice as strong. So a much hoppier beer than you'd find for grisette. Le Petit Journal de Brasseur, this is a title of a section that I pulled out. So the journal operates mostly on question and answer form. So a brewer would write into the journal and say, hey, I'm trying to make this beer. How should I make it? Or I'm trying to make this beer. This was my plan. Does that sound good to you? And then the journal would respond to the brewer and say, yeah, that sounds good. This is what you should do. I like that you suggested that thing. Don't do this other thing you said you should do. Do this thing instead. And this, I think, is possibly one of the best starts to an article I've ever seen in the Petit Journal Brasseur. So, Saison derives from the term bière des saisons, beer of the season. So, my saisons are not acidic enough. Question: my saisons are hard and bitter, and they are not pleasant to drink. So, this dude's got a real problem. And as I mentioned, the hopping of saison was used to regulate the acidity, and he wants more acidity. It's not acidic enough. So the very insightful masterminds behind the Petit Journal de Brasseur respond to this question of his very bitter saison and say, I think the problem is you're probably using too many hops, and you should not use so many hops. Solve all the problems. So it won't be too bitter, and then that will allow more acidity to develop. And this is the general mindset of a saison brewer, balancing the acidity through time with the hopping rate. So if you wanted a more acidic saison, you have to use lower hopping rates. There's a strong argument to be made that saison would have been similar to lambic to a fairly considerable degree. So generally not being a beer of spontaneous fermentation, but sometimes it would be. But in its resulting flavor profile. So in 1946, the Petit Journal de Brasseur has an article about lambic where they discuss its similarity to saison. And they say that in 1946, lambic from the 1800s was more bitter than the lambic of the 1940s. So lambic used to be more bitter, and it's moving in a less bitter direction. The lambic hopping rates used to be around 700 to 800 grams per hectoliter, which is a pretty big hopping rate. Modern lambic hopping rates are around 300 to 400 grams per hectoliter. Saison hopping rates up to a kilogram per hectoliter, which agrees generally with the table I just showed. And the article says that saison is probably similar to old lambic. So the saison of the 1940s was probably like the lambic of the 1800s in terms of the balance between bitterness and acidity. These two labels here they're labels of a saison, so this saison Jaurès and its type Goose lambic. So they're describing their saison as the lambic style saison in both of these. There's also brewers that are blending their beers with lambic, either before fermentation or after fermentation. So before fermentation, possibly to try to guide their beer down a lambic-like direction of fermentation, or possibly just to get some of that flavor in and drop the pH a bit. And on the post side, they brew a beer that they don't want to age, blend in some aged beer, and then they have a beer that kind of tastes a bit like an aged beer in the end. It would be different, and consumers would know the difference potentially. But it's a lot cheaper to make a young beer and put a little bit of old beer in than to make exclusively an old beer. So it results in a different beer, but there are two different ways to go about making a beer with some old beer characteristics. On the topic of blending, these labels at the bottom, or these cutouts at the bottom, are all either breweries or vinegar makers wishing to sell their products for blending with beer. So these guys are selling lambic for coupage, so for cutting, for blending with a beer. Also lambic here to be lambic for blending, and then this vinegar for blending. So this gives you a bit of insight into potentially what the lambic would have tasted like at the time if brewers are buying vinegar to pour into their beer to make a beer that tastes like an aged beer. Like, the lambic is somewhat of a hard lambic, which agrees with some of the general acid profiles I've seen in historic lambic. So blending of old beer with young beer might have been kind of gnarly based on the taste preferences of people at the time, but there could have been a considerable acetic acid component. Another thought on the Saison lambic overlap is with Cantillon's Iris. So Cantillon, probably the most famous lambic brewery in the world, makes one non-lambic, and that's Iris. because it's 100% barley. They're using Dingaman's pale ale or pale malt. So it's a 2-row barley malt. It's a little bit darker than a Pilsner malt, and it's 100% that. So there's no wheat, but otherwise they're spontaneously fermenting it. They're blending unaged hops with aged hops. And in historic land, they would have not used necessarily aged hops as well. So some overlap with Saison and the fresh hops, overlap with Saison and 100% barley, and the aged acidic profile. So those beers, potentially, Iris gives you a good insight into what historic Saison might have been. If you wanted to brew a historic Saison, and you really want to do it the historic way, I would source some winter 6-row barley, which might be a bit of a task. Possibly the inclusion of wheat or oats, and I would probably lean towards unmalted, because that would be better for a beer for aging. And generally target an amber-colored wort. So maybe something like a pale ale malt would be good in a long boil, maybe a little bit of Vienna malt. The mashing would have been a complex multi-step infusion mash, starting very thick in the mid-40s and working your way up to... Do most of the people in here think of mashing in Celsius or Fahrenheit?
Yes.
Yes. The answer is yes. Perfect. Kelvin. Oh, I've got to do a little. My day job's a chemist. I can totally do that, but it'll take me a second. So starting in the low 40s or about 100 Fahrenheit, 100, 110 Fahrenheit, then moving your way up from there. And the start of the mash would have been more like a pile of wet grain than grain soaking in water. Do a long boil, 2 to 6 hours or more, using landrace low alpha hops at fairly high hopping rates. I have 4.5 grams per liter here, but moving your way up towards 10 is possibly in line with historic beer. It might not be the beer you want to drink. Late hops, if they're used, tend to come in these recipes with 20 minutes left in the boil. Although frequently a recipe might say, throw your finishing hops in and then boil for 2 hours and you're done. So finishing hops is sort of a generous term. Open cool outside. So this is a cool ship, obviously no longer in use, but at a Saison brewery that's been a Saison brewery for more than 100 years. And they used this cool ship up until about 20 years ago. So using open cooling is something that would have been integral to the production of Saison historically. And some breweries still actually do it. This brewery came very close to doing it in the modern world, or the current world, and they did do it in the modern world. And then open ferment in barrels or tanks. I think most of us might have a good idea what open barrel, or what barrels would be to ferment. But if you're open fermenting in a tank, this is an open tank fermenter in Belgium, not from a Saison brewery necessarily, but this is the sort of thing that is being used and would have been used historically. So just an open square tank. And then age months to years. You're designing the beer such that it's fairly astringent when it's young, but then when it's old, it's no longer so astringent, and that'll drop out. So to generally compare historic grisette and Saison, they're both beers of the Hainaut province, so they come from the same region. They both have stories tied to the working class. Grisette has stories tied to industry. I didn't spend much time talking about that today because the only times I've ever read it are in English language sources from the last 20 years. And so if they're talking about grisette from 200 years ago, that's not the authority to me. I think potentially grisette was tied to industry, and I haven't been looking in the right places because I've been looking in the brewing type literature rather than the culture type literature, which might have that sort of information. So I don't disagree that grisette was a beer of industry, but I'm just not confident presenting that as that. Saison, similarly, I've not seen Saison as a beer tied to agriculture, but that's the lore of Saison. So they both have stories tied to the working class. But grisette, fundamentally from its roots, is a beer that's not designed for age, whereas Saison is. And every decision after that, I think, falls back on that one big crux. So I think typically people say that grisette is like a low-strength Saison. I would say that based on the history, grisette is a beer similar to Saison that's not designed for age. So what that means, you would make a beer that's less hoppy. A grisette would be less hoppy than a Saison. You'd make a beer that's lower strength. Grisette generally would be a lower strength beer than a Saison. You might choose different ingredients. You're not going to use unmalted wheat. You possibly are going to use a different barley to make a grisette, all to help make a beer be a better beer young. versus what you would do for a saison. Historic saisons would have been acidic. Grisettes, I think, would not have been acidic. And grisette was brewed year-round, whereas saison was not. And these are two labels. One of them I've shown already today. But these are labels from the same brewery making a saison that's a Category 1. So again, that puts us around 1050. And a Category 3, which, if you trust the gravities given in the Belgian Ale book, would have been around 1015, maybe 1020. So a considerable difference in gravities. I think that's not quite the correct gravity, but anyway, about 1050 and about 1020 for the gravities of those two beers, made by the same brewery at roughly the same time. Okay, if you were like, hey, that was a cool talk about history, but I don't want to make a historic beer, I'm totally down with that. I also don't really want to make a historic beer. I want to learn from what was done historically to make a different beer better, in a modern sense with my personal taste preferences. So this is the way that I would go about modernizing a grisette. I would switch from the spring 6-row to a continental Pilsner malt, which would be a 2-row malt. The chitted wheat is fairly hard to source, so the way that brewers recommend trying to emulate a chitted barley is to use a mixture of normal barley malt and flaked barley. So on the chitted wheat side, I would just do analogous to that. I would blend wheat malt and flaked wheat, because that's a lot easier to get a hold of. You could possibly add some additional grains. I've never seen anything in any of the sources I've looked at that mention any grains other than barley and wheat in a grisette. So I don't think it has a lot of historical basis, but I don't think it's a terrible thing to do. So if you wanted to put some oats in, if you wanted to put some rye in, some spelt in, like I think that's okay. I think you could totally do that. So possibly add some additional grains. I don't think you need to do a 5-step mash. I think you could probably simplify that. Four, yeah, you could cut out one of those steps, man. Go down to 4. I think you could brew a good grisette with a single infusion. I think 2 steps would also be good, and maybe 3 steps. The hopping rates, I would use noble or noble type hops, because you probably don't have access to the Belgian hops that don't exist anymore. So I'm gonna maybe you might have some. So I won't say certainly, but yeah, use noble or noble type hops. Typically, I don't think grisette would have had a high dose of late hopping. In general, Belgian beers didn't have a high dose of late hopping, from what I've seen. I think you could push more towards late hopping, which would be more in line with modern tastes and probably make a beer that you'll enjoy more. I think you could also use some New World hops. I don't think grisette should be a session IPA, and I think some brewers make grisette as a session Belgian IPA. So if you're going to use New World hops, I would not push as much to the late hops as if you were going to stick with the noble hops. For the fermentation, if grisette was a beer of mixed culture that didn't have time for that mixed culture, I think using a pure yeast is a reasonable thing to do. So I don't think you need to bother using a blend of bacteria and Brett and Saccharomyces to produce it. If you decide that you really want to do that, I would still keep it fairly young, so that grisette shouldn't be a dominantly sour beer or a dominantly Brettanomyces flavored beer. But yeah, I think pure culture is a reasonable way to go about it. So the recipe for the beer that you drank tonight, both the dry hop to non-dry hop is up here now. The original gravity was 1033, and this, again, the slides I think you all will get access to later. But the original gravity 1033, the alcohol about 3.7%. About 30 IBUs. I used 78.6% spring 2-row feed barley. So for the purposes of sharing in recipes, this was probably the shittiest thing for me to do. But it's a malt that's grown and malted on the island, on Vancouver Island. So I like using it, but it's not commercially available. So the reasons I chose it were, I think it does have something in common with historic grains. I like the way it tastes. I like the way that it behaves when I brew with it. But it's somewhat worthless if you wanted to copy it, because you can't. so I'm sorry about that. But I think if you just used a continental Pilsner malt, a continental European Pilsner malt, I think that'd be fine. I don't think you would really notice a big difference from this. I used 14.3% wheat malt and 7.1% flaked wheat. So a little bit higher wheat than historically in grisette. And I did this blending of wheat malt and flaked wheat because I didn't want to try to source a whole sack of chitted wheat for myself. That would take me years to go through. The hopping rate was in total 4 grams per liter, split evenly between the 60-minute edition and the 15-minute edition. and the dry hopping was a 0.5 gram per liter of Syrian Goldings. The mash was a 3-step infusion, so 10 minutes at 43 Celsius or 110 Fahrenheit. This is because of the malt that I'm using, and this rest was super thick, so again, like a pile of wet grain rather than grain with water. This 2-row feed barley is under-modified and has a high amount of beta-glucans. So this is a beta-glucan rest here to kind of break that down. It's what the historic producers would have done. It would have been fitting for historic malt. It was fitting for the malt that I used. It isn't necessary or necessarily fitting for normal modern malt. So you can just cross that out if you don't want to use it, but that's what I did. 15 minutes in a protein range at 53.3 Celsius or 128 Fahrenheit. It's on the lower end of protein rests. Well, it's towards the middle, but a little bit on the lower end. That's to benefit, I'm sorry I don't know the name of the enzyme off the top of my head, but it's a proteolytic enzyme that cleaves free amino acids. And free amino acids are what's necessary to form Maillard reactions, so to darken the wort. So I'm increasing the potential for my wort to become dark by the same duration of boil by choosing a protein rest slightly cooler than a normal protein rest, which I think would have been in line with historic beers. And then a normal saccharification rest on the low end, so 65 Celsius, 149 Fahrenheit. In general, this mashing profile is pretty similar to a classic Belgian mashing profile. Belgian brewers are plus or minus a couple degrees would probably do something like 45, 55, 65, and then 72. So this is, even the modern brewers, it's fairly close to what a modern Saison brewer would do. 90-minute boil, and the yeast was cultured from a bottle from Brasserie Thierry. So why yeast 3711 is theoretically from Brasserie Thierry. They're definitely different yeasts in terms of their attenuation, in terms of how they look when they ferment, and in terms of their flavor profile, they're different yeasts. So it's not 3711, but theoretically it's from the same origin. The final gravity is about 1006, 1007. So as anybody that's used 3711 will know, mashing at 149 or 65 degrees will not yield a beer of that final gravity with 3711. It would yield a beer with like 1.000 final gravity. So definitely different beers. If you are one of like the 3 people in this room that was like, awesome, this is like everything I want to learn more about, this slide's for you. And if you're not one of those 3 people, thank you for listening to me for so long. So if you want to learn more about grisette and Saison, and you're like, this is a really cool thing to spend my time thinking about, please talk to me. So this is my contact information. But before that, Farmhouse Ales and Brewing with Wheat, both great books. They have a lot of little nuggets in there. Brewing with Wheat doesn't focus on grisette or Saison necessarily, but it has a lot of good information about using wheat, which is relevant to brewing grisette and Saison. And Farmhouse Ales, of course, has excellent information. If you happen to be going to Belgium or France, visit the breweries. Generally, the breweries are fairly welcoming or have organized visitation days. So look on the brewery website and make a trip out there. It can be pretty cool if you're interested in these sorts of beers. There's lots of interviews, podcasts, and presentations out there about these. The Shelton Brothers have a YouTube channel. They're one of the main beer importers to the U.S. And they have a YouTube channel where they interview some of these breweries, or some of the brewers. Yvonne Debates is the world expert on Saison, so anything that has him on it, there'll be some good information. There's a Facebook group for Saison, Beer to Garden, Farmhouse Ales, and it's about 75% pictures of beer that people are drinking and 25% discussion of the beers. So yeah, pretty typical of Facebook. And maybe I'm being generous on the discussion side. Maybe it's 90-10 or 95-5. But anyway, if you're interested in these sorts of beers, and you happen to like spending your time looking at pictures of beers that other people are drinking, that might be a worthwhile group. Maybe I'm underselling it, really mad at me now. And then different blogs are looking at this. So my blog is up at the top. If I say it like a non-francophone would say it, it's Horse Category Brewing or Category. Brown and Bitter I mentioned before. A friend of mine, Amos, writes that. Farmhouse Beer blog has some good interviews at different Saison breweries, where he goes there and talks to the brewer. And then if you're interested in actual farmhouse brewing, mostly I talked about industrial brewing today. If you're interested in actual farmhouse brewing, Lars' blog talks about Scandinavian farmhouse ales, and there's some pretty interesting stuff on there. If you want to get a hold of me, I'm obviously here now, so you can talk to me. But this is my contact information if you want to send me an email, and the website and Facebook page for my blog. So I spend a lot of time talking about historic Belgian beer on those things. So if you're interested in those, I've shown you a pretty good overview of what I've covered on Grisette, but there's definitely more information on the blog, and then also more things like historic lambic brewing, a little bit of historic French brewing makes it in here and there, and other historic Belgian beers, and then the general homebrewers I'm doing. So if you're interested in more of what I'm doing, that's my information. Yeah, thanks for your time and listening to me talk for so long.